Disclaimer: this story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. The moment began with a glance that lingered too long. The kind that makes your chest tighten and your thoughts stumble. In the car, the city lights blurred against the windows, painting fleeting streaks across her skin, across his hands as they brushed in quiet rebellion. No words were spoken, none were needed. Each subtle touch carried a weight heavier than any conversation, a silent agreement that something unspoken had shifted between them. Her pulse raced in tandem with the hum of the tires on the asphalt, and she could feel the tension in the space between them, a delicate wire vibrating with desire she hadn't expected. Outside, the night waited silently, indifferent to the storm inside the car. He kept his eyes on the road, yet every so often her gaze found him, and the brush of his fingers against her leg sent sparks where it shouldn't. She fought the urge to move closer, to bridge the space between restraint and surrender. In that fleeting stillness, she realized that the night held a dangerous kind of possibility, one that promised both thrill and consequence. The quiet was thick, almost suffocating, and yet intoxicating in its restraint. By the time the car slowed at their destination, the tension had twisted into something irreversible. The door opened and the air outside was cooler, sharper, yet it did nothing to cool the heat that lingered inside. She stepped out, and there she was already in her husband's lap, an effortless claim that left no room for words. For a moment time froze, and she registered the world only in glances and gestures. The air between them was electric, charged with unspoken acknowledgement. Her body hummed with decisions that had been made without her mind's permission. Every glance, every breath was a silent pact that spoke louder than any argument or explanation could. They didn't speak. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just the quiet recognition that their bodies had already drawn the lines they dared not cross aloud. The thrill was in the balance. The knowledge that each movement carried meaning, each hesitation a confession. In that frozen beat of the night, she felt the pull of desire and the weight of loyalty warring in equal measure. And yet, despite the tension, there was a strange sort of peace in the surrender, in allowing the unspoken to take shape and dictate their next moves. The room around them seemed distant, as if the world had folded away to make space for this fragile, dangerous dance. It was in the tilt of a head, the curve of a smile, the faint brush of hands across knees, where the story truly unfolded. Every heartbeat was a drum of decision, every shared glance a question with no answer. And just as the moment seemed poised to tip into chaos or confession, she stepped back and the night held its breath with them. What would happen next no one could say, but in that stillness, in that charged, suspended moment, the stage was set for everything that could follow, leaving the audience teetering on the edge of anticipation and desire. The room seemed smaller now, almost intimate, though it was large enough to hold the quiet hum of the city outside. She could feel it in the air, the kind of tension that didn't need explanation, the kind that wrapped around them like a soft cloak. Every movement they made carried weight. When her husband shifted in his seat, brushing against her side ever so slightly, she caught her breath and looked away, only to find his gaze lingering on her longer than it should. They walked through the doorway, each step measured, as if testing the space between propriety and temptation. She sensed the pull of the other woman nearby, calm and collected, yet completely aware of the currents running between them. No words were exchanged, and that was the point. The silence held meaning, charged with a complexity they hadn't yet named. Every glance became a conversation, every small gesture an overture. The brush of fingers across a countertop, the almost accidental touch when reaching for a drink, the shared smile that faded too quickly, these tiny sparks ignited the room with a quiet electricity. They found themselves drawn to each other naturally, as though an invisible thread had wound around their movements. At one point she adjusted a stray lock of hair, catching his reflection in the mirror behind her. His eyes were on her, unwavering, and in that gaze she felt a wave of recognition and longing she couldn't name. He didn't speak, but the way his hand twitched slightly, hovering in anticipation of contact, told her everything. The heat wasn't physical, it was elemental, rooted in shared understanding, curiosity, and the thrill of what might be. Her heart raced, though she forced herself to breathe calmly. She wanted to cross the line, to let her impulses dictate the moment, yet something held her back. Loyalty, fear, or the quiet awareness that the world outside would judge if they were ever discovered. But the tension didn't dissipate. It only thickened. Each time she stole a glance at him, she caught him stealing one back, the look saying more than any words ever could. Every small movement, his hand brushing the edge of the table, her foot tapping lightly against the floor, seemed amplified, intimate, as if the room itself conspired to make every heartbeat louder. The other woman remained nearby, a silent observer in the unfolding drama, and that too added layers to the tension. She watched the two of them interact, her expression neutral but her presence undeniable. The three of them shared a space thick with unspoken longing, yet there were no accusations, no confrontations, only the push and pull of desire held in check by restraint. She realized that sometimes the strongest connections weren't about actions, but about anticipation. And anticipation had them both on edge, hearts racing, breath shallow, thoughts spiraling in ways neither of them could easily articulate. They moved through the night like dancers in a carefully choreographed performance, every step deliberate, every pause pregnant with possibility. He leaned slightly closer when she reached for a book, the subtle proximity sending shivers down her spine. She didn't pull away, though a part of her wanted to, savoring instead the closeness, the invisible tension that hung between them like warm fog. Words were unnecessary, the silence said everything, and the electricity in that quiet made the air feel dense, almost tangible. And yet neither acted. They hovered in that delicate balance, teetering on the edge of surrender, knowing the moment could tip in a heartbeat but unwilling to let it fully. Their inner conflicts played across their faces, revealed in slight frowns, soft sighs, and the occasional brush of skin that lingered too long to be accidental. She realized how dangerous it was to be near him, how much power was held in a single look, a single movement, a single touch. And yet she couldn't pull herself away, couldn't stop the pull of that quiet, smoldering connection. The night stretched on, every minute drawn out by the electricity in the room. They shared fleeting conversations, whispers that hovered between confessions and teasing, each one igniting further tension. She caught herself imagining what it would be like to let go, to act on what they both felt, but just as quickly she grounded herself in the knowledge that restraint could make desire burn brighter. And it did. The chemistry between them wasn't fleeting, it was constant, unavoidable, and utterly consuming. By the time the clock crept toward midnight, she understood one thing clearly. Nothing had been resolved, nothing had been spoken, but everything had been felt. And in that feeling the world shrank to just the three of them, the silence and the potent promise of what might come. The night stretched on, heavy with unspoken thoughts and the weight of choices neither of them wanted to confront. She lingered near the window, tracing the city lights outside with her eyes, but every glance toward him pulled her attention back, as though gravity itself had shifted toward the quiet tension between them. He stood across the room, hands tucked into his pockets, pretending to examine something on a nearby shelf. Yet she could feel the intensity of his gaze even without looking. The air between them was thick, charged, almost electric, and she shivered despite the warmth of the room. There was something forbidden in the way they existed in the same space, something intoxicating in the restraint that held them just out of reach. Neither spoke, yet every movement spoke volumes. She shifted slightly, almost brushing his hand as she reached for a glass of water. He froze, his fingers hovering as if the briefest touch could shatter the fragile calm. And then she pulled back, letting the moment linger, savoring the ache that tension created. Desire, she realized, was more powerful when held at the brink. The other woman remained a quiet presence, a mirror to their emotions without a single word. She moved with deliberate calm, crossing the room with a book in hand, placing it on the table, and then settling into the sofa as though she belonged there. But her presence only amplified the unspoken. It reminded them of the boundaries they weren't ready to cross, of the complicated dance of loyalty, curiosity, and longing. Each glance exchanged between them was loaded with meaning, yet each smile or fleeting touch hinted at what could never fully be allowed. He moved closer to the window where she stood, their shoulders nearly brushing. The air between them tightened, taut like a drawn bow. She could feel the heat of his presence, the subtle scent of him lingering in the space around her, making it impossible to focus on anything else. A hand hovered near her arm, almost grazing it, and she froze, caught between the urge to lean in and the instinct to retreat. She wanted him, that much was undeniable, but she wanted it controlled, measured, safe in a way that defied the intensity she felt. They circled each other with words unspoken, revealing more in silence than any conversation could manage. Each small gesture, a tilt of a head, a half smile, a quick glance, was a confession without confession. She imagined what it would feel like to let go, to surrender to the pull she could not ignore. But the thought of what came after, the complications it would bring, kept her rooted in place. And he, equally restrained, felt it too. His fingers twitched, itching to touch, yet he held himself back, knowing that sometimes the anticipation itself was the most exquisite torment. Outside, the city hummed quietly, a muted counterpoint to the storm brewing indoors. She moved to the kitchen counter, absently arranging glasses, and he followed, maintaining just enough distance to keep the tension alive. Their shadows intertwined on the polished floor, a silent dance that mirrored their inner struggle. She reached for a napkin and their hands brushed. The contact was fleeting, yet it left an echo, a whisper of heat that lingered long after their fingers separated. Neither spoke, yet each felt the pulse of unspoken words, the magnetic pull of something dangerously close to crossing the line. Time seemed to bend around them. Every heartbeat was heightened, every glance a reminder of what they wanted but could not claim. She wondered at the emotional walls each of them carried, the commitments, the fears, the unvoiced insecurities. And yet those very walls seemed to make the attraction stronger, sharper, more insistent. There was an elegance to restraint, she realized, a poetry in what was left unsaid. And in that suspended moment, the longing felt almost unbearable, a tide that pulled at their senses, refusing to let them rest. He leaned slightly, almost close enough to speak a word, yet the space remained intact. His eyes searched hers, reading the same desires reflected back, and she understood then that the tension was no accident. They were both captives of the same longing, prisoners of the unspoken, yet neither willing to surrender entirely. A quiet laugh escaped her lips, soft and nervous, and he responded with a slight smile that carried both mischief and understanding. It was enough to ignite the next spark, yet carefully restrained, the promise of what could come still hanging in the air like smoke. And so they existed in that delicate balance, suspended between temptation and caution, between yearning and propriety. The night seemed endless, each passing moment a mixture of thrill and restraint, each small interaction a story of longing that could never be fully told. Fingers brushed accidentally, glances lingered too long, and every heartbeat was a reminder of what lay beneath the surface. Desire was present, undeniable, but held back by the invisible walls they had built around themselves. Walls made of responsibility, fear, and the knowledge that some things, however tempting, were not yet ready to be touched. And yet the room seemed to vibrate with the possibilities of the night, with the unspoken confessions that hovered between them. No one moved too fast, no one overstepped, yet the tension built steadily, exquisitely. By the time the first faint light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, the air was thick with anticipation, with longing, with promises that had yet to be made and perhaps never would be. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment each was acutely aware of the fragile, beautiful fire burning between them, unseen, unvoiced, and unbearably alive. The room seemed to shrink around them, though it had not changed at all. The city lights through the windows spilled soft gold across the floor, illuminating the fine dust of particles in the air, as if the night itself had decided to hold its breath. She could feel it, the electricity between them, subtle yet undeniable. Every inhale carried the faint scent of him, every glance like a spark passing across her skin. The space was charged, taut with anticipation, and she realized that the world outside no longer existed. There was only this fragile, heated balance between what they felt and what they dared to show. He leaned against the counter, a casual pose, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. She watched him from the edge of the room, fingers lightly resting on the tabletop, feeling the thrum of her own pulse in her wrists. Her heart raced in a rhythm that was at once frightening and exhilarating. The silence between them was not empty, it was alive, vibrating with things left unsaid, desires restrained yet raw in their intensity. Every so often their eyes met across the space, and in that look entire conversations were spoken without a word. She took a careful step closer, almost imperceptibly, and he did the same. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of emotion neither could name. It wasn't just desire, though that pulsed through her veins, but the hunger for connection, the ache to be understood, to be seen, to be felt without needing to speak. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, and yet part of her held back, afraid that acknowledgement might shatter the delicate tension they had built together. He shifted slightly, and the movement was enough. Their fingers almost brushed, the space between them thinner than a breath. She froze, feeling the thrill of the near touch travel up her arm, igniting every nerve. A soft laugh escaped her, nervous, tremulous, and he responded with a slight curve of his lips, his eyes reflecting the same wild electricity she felt coursing through her. No one moved further, and yet the room felt alive with what could have been, as if the atmosphere itself had absorbed every unspoken thought. The other woman in the room remained quiet, sitting at a distance, but even her calm presence seemed to heighten the intensity. They existed in a bubble of emotion that excluded her, even though she was there physically. And perhaps it was her quiet, unshakable presence that allowed the two of them to inch closer to the edge, their restraint so exquisite that every small gesture felt monumental. He stepped forward just a little, and her breath hitched, their eyes locked again, unflinching, searching for permission or perhaps understanding. For a moment it seemed as though the room had condensed into a single point, the world reduced to two people and the electricity crackling in the air between them. Her fingers twitched, almost moving to his arm, almost daring to close the gap she had longed for. Yet she stayed still, savoring the intensity, holding the moment like a fragile treasure. A whisper broke the silence, soft and fragile, almost inaudible over the distant hum of the city. She thought she imagined it at first, a sigh or a name, but he leaned closer, enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence radiating toward her. The proximity made the room seem smaller, the world outside irrelevant. The whisper was not a declaration, not a confession, but it carried weight. It was a thread, a bridge, a line drawn in the air between them that trembled with possibility. They remained there, suspended, each acutely aware of the other's breathing, the faint rise and fall of shoulders, the pulse at the wrist, the tremor in the fingers that hovered just shy of contact. Desire and restraint were entwined, inseparable, like two dancers holding a pose at the pinnacle of a crescendo, each waiting for the other to lead or to retreat. And in that waiting, in that silent understanding, the air itself seemed to pulse, alive with the promise of what might come if one of them dared to cross the invisible line. He leaned slightly, not close enough to touch, not close enough to speak, but close enough that she felt the brush of energy between them like fire. She tilted her head, almost unconscious, drawn by that invisible current, and for a heartbeat it seemed possible that they would finally surrender to the pull. Her lips parted slightly, her breath shallow, and his gaze softened, holding 1,000 emotions without a single word. The room vibrated with anticipation, the very air holding its breath in tandem with them. And then, just as the tension seemed poised to break, they paused, caught between yearning and fear, between the allure of proximity and the weight of the unknown. Their hands hovered, almost touching, as if the universe had slowed its rotation to watch them make a choice. The silence stretched, exquisite, unbroken, leaving the room trembling with unspoken confessions. It was the most intimate moment yet, not because of actions taken but because of restraint, because of desire felt fully, deeply, without release. Every nerve in her body, every thought, every shiver was devoted to the unspoken, and the heat between them was almost unbearable. They didn't touch, they didn't speak, but the space between them had never felt smaller, never more electric. Every heartbeat, every breath, every glance screamed what words could not, and in that suspended moment the room itself seemed to vibrate with the intensity of their unfulfilled longing, as if the universe waited alongside them, breathless, for the inevitable spark that had not yet fallen. The night had changed, rain tapped softly against the windows, a gentle rhythm that mirrored the quickening beats of their hearts. The room was dim, lit only by the golden glow of lamps and the shimmer of wet streets beyond the glass. The world outside seemed distant, irrelevant. Here, in the quiet pulse of the storm, everything else fell away. There was only them and the electricity that had been building for nights, now poised on the edge of surrender. She moved closer without thinking, drawn by an invisible force, her fingertips brushing the fabric of his sleeve. The contact was light, fleeting, yet it carried the weight of every unspoken word between them. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Their eyes held the conversation, a tangle of curiosity, longing, and confession too potent for language. And then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted closer, the air between them alive with possibility. The rain outside grew heavier, its soft drumming echoing the rhythm of their breaths. Her shoulder brushed his, a whisper of contact that set every nerve on fire. She inhaled sharply, her breath melting into his presence, and in that single moment the world contracted to the space their bodies shared. They didn't move fast, there was no rush, only the slow, simmering awareness of each other's nearness. The tension that had tormented them for so long unfurled like silk, delicate and unstoppable. He reached up, not to touch but to brush a strand of hair from her face. Her eyes closed at the gesture and the faintest shiver ran down her spine. Their bodies spoke the words they couldn't say. A tilt of his head, a soft inhale of breath, a brush of fingers over knuckles. All of it conveyed the longing, the ache, the sweetness of restraint finally yielding to connection. Each movement was a declaration, elegant in its restraint, impossible to ignore. She leaned slightly into him, her cheek near his chest, feeling the subtle rise and fall of his breath. He shifted closer, his warmth pressing against her back, a soft anchor in the storm outside and the storm within. The room hummed with their proximity, every shadow, every flicker of light highlighting the intimacy that had been simmering for nights. Their connection was not about desire in the usual sense, it was about being seen, being understood, being mirrored in another human being in a way that left the heart raw and alive. Their breaths intertwined, a laugh soft and breathless escaped her, and he responded with a faint smile that reached his eyes, softening the intensity of the moment. Fingers traced invisible patterns along arms, along shoulders, each brush deliberate and tender. They existed in this suspended world where time slowed, where the night bent around the electricity flowing between them. Every shiver, every glance, every breath was a word, a sentence, a confession spoken without sound. The rain darkened the streets outside, shimmering on the glass, and they both found themselves mesmerized, their reflections merging with the wet world beyond. She rested her forehead lightly against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and in that small stolen connection the tension that had weighed on her so heavily finally softened. He didn't move away, he simply held her there, as if understanding that even this small closeness was a triumph, a revelation of what they had been craving without realizing. Time seemed irrelevant. Every heartbeat, every inhale, every subtle brush of skin against skin was magnified in its intensity. Their presence, their warmth, their shared silence, these were the things that mattered. A sigh escaped him, low and unsteady, and she pressed closer, letting her own pulse echo against his. Their bodies didn't need to act. The intimacy was in being, in surrendering to proximity, in the heat of knowing someone else understood the unspoken ache within them. He tilted his head and their foreheads touched, soft, gentle, trembling with the weight of everything they had held back. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his chest, the rhythm of his breathing, the quiet strength of him fill the space inside her that had long been waiting. A soft laugh, almost a whisper, broke the tension briefly, and they smiled, knowing the world had shifted for them in this quiet surrender. The night pressed in around them, thick with emotion, heavy with longing, yet beautifully restrained. Their bodies spoke in whispers, in glances, in subtle brushes of hands and fingers that lingered too long to be accidental. It was breathtaking, intoxicating, a moment suspended between desire and confession, between restraint and release. And though they had not crossed the final threshold, the emotional intimacy was undeniable. They had let go of the walls, if only for a moment, and the connection left them trembling in its afterglow, hearts alive with the promise of what could come next. The rain continued its soft rhythm, a lullaby to their shared moment. The city outside remained unaware, but inside the room the storm had found them, wrapped around them like a silk shroud. Every heartbeat, every whisper, every stolen glance carried the weight of a story finally being told, not in words but in the language of touch, proximity, and the magnetic pull of two hearts finally recognizing one another. Morning seeped slowly into the room, brushing pale light across the walls and onto their still quiet forms. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets outside glistening under the soft glow of dawn. Inside, the air was heavy with the residue of last night's unspoken confessions. The silent electricity that had lingered even as they had retreated into themselves. The warmth of their proximity was gone now, replaced by the weight of thought, of what had been felt, of the impossibility of naming it. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. Her heart still carried the tremor of last night, a pulse she couldn't calm. He sat across the room, leaning back against the chair, the faint curve of a smile in his eyes betraying that he too was haunted by the intensity of what had passed. Neither spoke, as if words could undo the delicate weave of emotions they had created, or perhaps words would make the aftermath too real. Silence was safer, though it pressed on them both like a tide. Guilt hovered quietly at the edges of their minds. Was it wrong? Was it inevitable? Was it something more than desire, a connection deeper than either had expected? Every glance across the room carried the weight of questions neither dared to answer aloud. Their hands itched to reach for each other again, to recreate the fragile intimacy that had been both a release and a revelation. But they held back, knowing that morning, with its clarity and light, demanded a reckoning they weren't ready to face. She shifted slightly, eyes tracing the contours of the room, the books left on the table, the reflections of the city in the window, the soft outline of him against the lamplight. Each detail anchored her, yet reminded her of the space that had grown between them overnight. There was longing still, thick and undeniable, but also awareness, desire and restraint, emotion and consequence, all layered into a messy human complexity. She wondered if he felt the same storm of conflicting feelings, if he too wrestled with the impossibility of what they had allowed themselves to feel. He finally spoke, voice soft, low, hesitant yet steady. Morning feels different after that. He didn't finish the sentence, but she knew what he meant. The air hummed between them, every pause and inflection charged with the weight of their shared experience. She nodded, not trusting her voice, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. They had crossed an invisible line, had let something fragile bloom between them, and now they were left to reckon with its aftermath. The rain-slicked streets outside reflected in the window, a mirror to the mess of their own emotions. Her thoughts wandered to what had brought them here. Years of subtle glances, unspoken attraction, long moments of silence that had built tension over time. And yet she knew that what they had shared was not merely the fulfillment of desire. It was recognition, a mirror of longing and vulnerability, a connection that neither could pretend to ignore. Then a soft knock at the door broke the fragile cocoon of their introspection. Both startled, they glanced at each other, the tension instantly sharp. Who could be here now? Their eyes met, silent acknowledgement passing between them, the outside world intruding on a private universe. She rose cautiously, heart hammering, and opened the door to reveal the unexpected presence of the other woman, the quiet observer from last night. She stood in the doorway, umbrella dripping, eyes alert yet gentle. "Morning," she said simply, a faint smile brushing her lips. The atmosphere shifted immediately. What had been just theirs, a fragile suspended intimacy, was now shared, acknowledged, and yet there was no accusation, no judgment. Her presence was steadying, a reminder that connection came in many forms, and that last night had been something far more layered than any single act. The three of them exchanged quiet glances, unspoken understanding flowing through the room. The moment was surreal, fragile yet somehow grounding. He stepped slightly closer to her, a small protective gesture, and she felt the weight of his presence, warm and steady beneath the uncertainty. And in that subtle movement she realized that last night had shifted something irreversible, not merely desire but awareness. They were connected now in a way that went beyond words, beyond labels, beyond fear. Breakfast was made in near silence, the rhythm of coffee and toast punctuating an otherwise still room. The conversation was careful, delicate, woven with subtle glances and light touches, acknowledging the bond forged without ever naming it. Each small gesture, a hand lightly brushing against another, a shared smile, spoke volumes about what had transpired, about the longing that lingered. They were no longer the same people they had been last night. They were something richer, more complicated, more alive, and yet the questions remained. Was it love? Was it escape? Or simply a rare moment of truth, an unveiling of desires that had always existed but had been hidden in plain sight? The ambiguity made the tension sweeter, sharper, more intoxicating. They could feel it pulsing in the space between them, and even as the morning progressed it refused to dissipate. By the time the first light of day fully filled the room, the world outside had returned. Cars moved on the street, birds called from nearby trees, life went on. But inside, a different kind of life had begun. One marked by understanding, intimacy, and the quiet thrill of shared secret knowledge. They had crossed into territory that could not be undone. And though the consequences of the night would follow them, they also carried the promise of connection that was unshakable, undeniable, and breathtaking in its quiet intensity. The room was quiet in a way that felt like it had been holding its breath for hours. Morning light spilled gently across the floor, washing the space in golden shadow as if the world itself acknowledged the intimacy of the night behind them. She sat near the window, tracing the faint pattern of raindrops from last night, and he stood a few steps away, their gazes meeting in a silence that no longer felt heavy, only tender. It was a silence filled with understanding. The storm that had raged between them, the tension, the unspoken confessions, the longing that had electrified their hearts had settled into something quieter, warmer. They didn't need words anymore. Their connection had been forged not in noise but in pauses, in glances, in the subtle brush of hands. Every heartbeat carried the memory of the closeness they had shared, and now it hung between them like a soft melody, lingering and comforting. She rose slowly, closing the small distance between them, careful, deliberate. When she reached him, her fingers brushed lightly against his arm, not a gesture of ownership but of acknowledgement. He looked down at her, eyes soft, unguarded, and she saw there the same quiet recognition she had felt herself, that something precious had been found and could never be undone. He reached up, fingertips resting gently on her cheek, and she leaned in, letting the weight of her forehead touch his. Their eyes closed almost in unison, and the room seemed to hold them, suspended in the delicate warmth of a shared breath. It was not passion in the frantic sense, it was intimacy, profound and slow, an understanding that the closeness of two hearts could be as powerful as any spoken word. For a long moment they simply existed together, foreheads pressed, breathing in sync, hearts beating with the rhythm of something unspoken but deeply felt. The night had been a revelation, but the morning offered peace, a choice to simply be present with one another. Every lingering touch, every soft sigh, was a promise made without the need for words. Outside, the city woke in gentle motion. Cars passed, people walked, and sunlight began to pour through the window. But inside, time moved differently. The world beyond could wait. Here in this quiet corner they had found a kind of completeness that was rare and delicate. And though the memory of tension, of desire, of things left unsaid would always remain, it was now tinged with comfort. A reminder that intimacy was as much about understanding as it was about yearning. The other woman, who had once been an observer, now stood at a respectful distance watching the moment unfold. She smiled faintly, not in judgment, but in acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged. There was no interruption, no commentary, just the quiet witness of someone who understood that love, longing, and connection could take many forms, and that the truest intimacy often required patience and space. She leaned slightly into him, arms loosely around his waist, and he responded with the gentlest of holds, the kind that spoke of safety and trust rather than urgency. The tension that had once been a storm now settled like sunlight filtering through leaves, soft, warm, and steady. And though they did not need to speak, there was a clarity in the stillness, an understanding that whatever had passed between them was now part of who they were, and that the memory of it would linger like perfume, delicate and unforgettable. Minutes stretched, unmeasured but full. The quiet intimacy of that morning carried all the weight of their shared emotions. The heat of longing now transformed into something calm, profound, and sustaining. Their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling, and in that small gesture there was both closure and promise. Closure of the tension that had haunted them, promise of the connection that would endure beyond any single night. Finally they parted, slowly, reluctantly, but without fear. The moment was not lost. It had been imprinted, etched into memory with tenderness and care. Each step they took away from that closeness was measured, reverent, carrying the knowledge that the connection they had shared was real, rare, and precious. They did not need to chase it, they had already found it in the simplest of gestures, the quietest of silences, and the most subtle of touches. As the sunlight fully illuminated the room, they exchanged a soft smile, a nod of acknowledgement, and perhaps unspokenly a promise to return to the warmth of this connection whenever life allowed. And when the door finally closed behind the observer, the room remained filled with a lingering intimacy, a testament to the depth of their hearts' quiet conversation, a memory that would remain vivid, alive, and achingly beautiful.